That's what it really has come to mean to be an economist over the course of the centuries, is to have a serious sort of willingness to defer to the processes of the social order, rather than believe you can always outsmart and plan everything that's going on around you. It's just not true, and more often than not, the attempt to do that results in just disaster. And that's true, whether you're talking about prohibition in 1920 to 33 or lockdowns in 2020.
Hello and welcome to And If Love Remains. I'm your host, Mike Levitt, and I am thrilled and excited to have on the show today Jeffrey A. Tucker. Mr. Tucker is the editorial director for the American Institute for Economic Research. He is an author of 9 books, including Bourbon for Breakfast, one of the greatest titles I think ever, and his latest book, which is Liberty or Lockdown, which we'll get into. He's also the editor of The Best of Mises, the book The Best of Mises, and I'm very thrilled to have on Mr. Tucker. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Listen, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's great. Thank you. Well, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is as I've seen some of your speeches and some of your talks, you seem like such a happy warrior. You seem like such a great guy, and you have such a passion and love for capitalism and the free market. And I'm curious, where did that come from? How did that kind of get instilled in you, and where did you just fall in love with these ideas?
Well, I think it's because when I was really young, I don't know, people are different, and I just always had this sort of passion for working. I remember the first time that I let me think, I was 9 years old or something like that. I went out with my father, and we were he had a friend who had a well on a ranch as a water well, and it needed to be repaired, and they stuck me down the well because I was really small. I didn't know I was invited. Then I found out why.
Oh, heaven.
Yeah. That was my advantage in the division of labor at the time. But I remember getting out of the well, repairing the thing, and it was a long, hot day, and I was thirsty. But then the man took out, $10 out of his wallet and handed it to me. And I thought, what? So I get to do something for somebody else, and then I get something in return? Like, I hadn't really experienced that, up to that point. Because, in school, all you have to do is, do what you're told. And there's no real reward other than like an abstraction, like an A or a B or a pass or a fail or something like that.
Right.
But you're not actually valuable to your teacher as such. You're just in the mode of compliance. You're taking up space, and your job's to comply. So within this one moment, I just had a revelation that I could be a valuable human being to other people and be rewarded for it. And I always never quite lost my sense of fascination with that, that he could take out a piece of property or a proxy for property out of his wallet and hand it to me in exchange for which I gave him, my time and labors to make his well work. And then he could, feed his and water his plants and feed his animals and so on. It's just like, okay, because of this one transaction, the world has made a better place. And I don't know. I think that was the moment, and then after that, I couldn't stop working. I was in school, but I always had a job, and I cared way more about my jobs than I ever did school. So I moved into roofing, and then fence building, and then finally into a maintenance at a department store, cleaning toilets and vacuuming carpets and digging pins out of dressing rooms and waxing the crystal section, which was harrowing for a young man. And
right.
And I just loved all the crushing boxes out back, and I just loved the bustly atmosphere of the local department store, and how they served people, and then they got rewarded for it, and then they would turn those rewards into hiring more people so they could serve more people. And just that dynamic of watching it work, it all just seemed magical to me. And then I will gradually work myself up to be a salesperson at that store. And then I actually dealt with real customers. And that was interesting because, it turns out not everybody is wonderful. So I discovered I discovered how working in a retail environment actually creates a new kind of discipline that you have, which is a kind of patience and tolerance. And I began to develop all that. And I don't know, it's just the magic of human interaction on a voluntary basis. Really just, obviously I'm reconstructing my past. I don't think all this stuff occurred to me at that time, but over time, I began to get enraptured by it more, and then I became a busboy, and then a chef, then I worked for a catering company, and
well, I think that's where. I was just sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to say, I think that's where your education really can inform your experiences. Like when you're going through these things, you're right. You don't see, you're learning how to deal with a customer, but then as you learn and as you see, I'll speak for myself. When I learn a philosophical concept, for example, and say, oh, I've already put that into practice in my work environment, and it does happen, and these things are powerful.
That's right. And so you then you encounter the theory, and it somehow makes sense of the intuition you've had about the course of your life. Right. So I guess I'm grateful for all those experiences. Now, one job I had, I eventually became the manager of a men's store and a buyer, which is really scary. Going out in January to buy the next fall's fashions. That's an entrepreneurial task. Wow,
everything is on the line for that season.
Yeah, that's right. And then I had a second job, which is I played for a dance band as a trombonist, and I really imagined at this point in my life that I would be, a musician. But one of the things I found in the School of Music, which I had already begun to hang around in at the university when I was already in high school because they needed me for their own jazz band, I found that they were kind of like not entirely happy people, and one of the reasons they're unhappy is that the musicians, at least at that level, never really liked their customer base. They got tired of the customers always demanding to hear Beethoven and Mozart when they really wanted to play, some far-flung, academically approved nonsense. Right. And so they all consider themselves underpaid, so they're always grousing all the time and whinging about their lives. And I don't want to be around grousy, whinging people. I wanted to be around happy people. So when I was trying to figure out what to major in, I bumped into the economics department. I just was fascinated by the idea of a science that would account for, the rise and fall of nations, the existence of wealth or the existence of poverty, the factors and logic behind work and earning and finance. And it struck me that economics was like summed up everything that really mattered about life. So I loved economics, and it took me a long time to finally, bump into the theoretical apparatus that has really governed my life. But at least early on, I liked even the bad economics. I just liked the topic.
Right. It is interesting. Money and economics is one of the subjects that is so intimate to each of our lives, and yet I think we understand it the least in a real way.
It's very strange how people kind of otherize economics or sectorize it. They put it over there as something that is separate from society. I just read an interview with Melinda Gates the other day, and she said, she was talking about the pandemic and the policies associated with it. She said, nothing about the coronavirus has surprised us, but in terms of its spread and so on. But one thing we never really thought about was the economic implications.
Isn't that shocking?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's sad. It's funny. And you bump into this all the time where people say, well, I don't know anything about economics. I was bored by economics. I didn't like economics. It's not really my area. But of course, that's a little bit wrong, because actually people are talking about and thinking about economics all the time, and it's just a question of whether or not you're doing it in a informed way, in a disciplined way, in a way that's consistent with humane values, or you're just stumbling through and making things up. And I think a lot of what's happened in this year has really come down to the fact that people just thought the economy was not really integral to the human life or our normal experiences every day. It's this weird sense of like we can turn it off, well then we turn it on when we want to, and we're going to say this is essential, that's not essential. Just this brutal treatment of the economy as if it's something other than the narrative of the life that we actually live day to day.
Yes. Well, and I think I also think one of the benefits of being an economist. I am not one. I am a musician, so I can relate to what you're talking about.
But that's not true of all musicians. By the way, so just so that we're clear, this is a kind of a highbrow academic set.
Right. Right.
I mean, like a lot of musicians love their audiences and get real joy out of playing. But when you get into academic music departments, there's a dreariness, that overcomes you.
It's interesting. But what I was going to say is I think one of the benefits of being an economist is it allows you to think in a different way. I've talked to attorneys and they say, being a lawyer allows you to think in a different way and that discipline. And one of the specific things an economist has to know or has to at least take into account are the unseen things that are happening around us. And in other words, why wouldn't you seek out an economist about the factors of what a coronavirus, a lockdown would do? I mean, that's the exact person you want to talk to because he's trained in knowing what the unseen consequences could be.
Right. Right. I mean, that's what the economists are very good at that. They try to see the counterintuitives, and they understand, as you say, the invisible costs, the foregone opportunities, the opportunity costs, the relations between all sectors of economic life, even the ones you can't see. It's a complicated network. And good economists are actually humble. They tend to defer to, the signaling systems and complexities of the social order. And that's what it really has come to mean to be an economist over the course of the centuries, is to have a serious sort of willingness to defer to the processes of the social order, rather than believe you can always outsmart and plan everything that's going on around you. It's just not true, and more often than not, the attempt to do that results in just disaster, and that's true. Whether you're talking about prohibition in 1920 to 33, or lockdowns in 2020.
Right. Right. And, so let's talk a little bit about what's going on. And let me put a little context from my perspective. I back in 2002, there was I think a pretty good show that introduced me to the world of Keynes and Hayek. And it was a PBS show of all things called Commanding Heights. It was I thought it was a pretty well done piece, and one of the things I was thinking about this in context of the coronavirus is one of the episodes began with I think it was a quote by Keynes saying that a British person in London in 1910 could sit at his table and order all the goods of the world and have it delivered to his door. And then of course, World War I happens. And for a century, those types of services or the world closes down. Let me put it that way. And I guess one of my fears, and I don't know if this is the fallacy of it being right in front of me right now, but one of my fears is that this coronavirus has the potential to be that kind of a problem where it shuts the world down for a longer period of time than we can imagine. Is that a fear that you have?
Well, I think it's a completely just fear, and your history here is extremely important. Which, by the way, I don't think one of the dangers I think that every intellectual has is to imagine that there's a kind of narrative structured history that creates an inevitability, like a baked-in patterns of waves, and this happens, then that happens, and so that we have no way out of it, And I don't believe that. So I think that tomorrow the world could just completely wake up and say this was a calamity. But nonetheless, it's very important to learn from this history. So let me just build out what you said just then a little bit more. That 1919 quote from Keynes came from his Economics of Peace, I guess, and really a really good book, actually. And he was right. So World War I set in motion these sort of dark forces that took over. So it was in that same period that we suddenly had, we threw out many aspects of liberalism at that point, with antitrust laws and so which really amount to a kind of form of industrial planning and income taxes and then central banking. And then in the United States, it was really during that period where we really entrenched things like minimum wage laws and then segregation to keep races apart and heavy regulation of business and regulation of the medical industry and many other controls over national life, and it just really, and obviously prohibition itself, which was 100% backed by the scientists. I've been doing some work on that this morning. I mean, it's just amazing the extent to which the scientific elite and all the Ivy League universities were completely behind prohibition, and they had all the numbers and the data and the credentials and everything. I'm just like, prohibition was a no-brainer. It was so bad you couldn't even find many intellectuals in America to even oppose the thing. So, and so, yeah, there was a really dark period, and then of course the Great Depression happened, and we borrowed, FDR borrowed many features of planning, industrial planning from Italy under Mussolini, and the world seemed to be split between fascism and socialism, and it was really grim. What was interesting during this period in the 1930s, especially after 1932 with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, that there were some really intelligent liberal economists at the time who saw what was happening and realized this is probably going to eventually lead to war. And if we want to build peace and prosperity, we have got to start with making sure that something like this Tariff Act never happens again. We really need to build a global economy. And they worked all throughout the 1930s. And really by 1934, we had begun to reverse some of that protectionist impulses and already struck a trade deal with Canada. And so the war interrupted the progress. But after the war, all these people were in sort of good positions, both in academia and in government, to really forge a new kind of liberal order post-World War II. And lower tariffs, increase trade, really try to stabilize the world to reduce the possibility of war. Imperfectly, obviously, but actually over 70 years, you can look and see that they really did triumph intellectually. The world became ever more about trade and integration and peace between people. And, you mentioned that PBS special, Commanding Heights, and in some ways that show is really wonderful because it represents a triumph of this post-war liberal vision which won out both theoretically and in practice. So people began to realize, we need to be free in order to be peaceful and prosperous. That was a great moment and kind of a repudiation of the planning mentality. I think, when that thing came out in the 1980s, we were unaware that we were maybe living in an unusual time.
Yes.
We were particularly lucky and fortuitous, and then really things began to change after that, and it probably began, I would say, really at the start of the new millennium, with the 9/11, and then everything really. I think during the 90s, we didn't have any kind of leadership in this country that really appreciated the role of free markets or even liberty at all. And then by the time we get to the 21st century, we have all these, a series of calamities that between, 2001 and 2006 really just kind of baked into our public lives, these presumption of draconian reactions to crises, whether they're, terrorism or pandemics or whatever. And I think in retrospect, we've been on this course for a long time, actually. I think 15 years we've been traveling down this road, and this year just everything got deployed, but it was already in place for the last 15 years, and it does seem to signal, the end of the age of liberty in some way. I don't want it to, but it seems like maybe that's true.
Well, it is. It's difficult to not, I guess, to not have that kind of perspective. For me, it seems it is analogous, and I think I guess that brings us, I think, to your book, Liberty or Lockdown, which I think is, I don't know how quickly you wrote this book. I don't know what your workflow is like, but it's a great, from what I've read bits of it, and I've really enjoyed it. And there's a part of the introduction that has really kind of echoed in my mind since I read it. And it's this simple paragraph where you write, the people with everything to gain from the lockdowns had nothing to lose. The people who had nothing to gain lost everything.
Yeah. That's basically a summary of this year.
Right.
Yeah, that does, and I've tried to write this theme over and over again, because you see it fleshing itself out, the way in which, I don't know, for lack of a better phrase, the ruling class just imagined that they could plan their way out of this pandemic, take control of the virus, take control of society, muscle people, tell people how many people that can be around, what schools can open, what schools can close, what surgeries you can get, and without any serious calculus of the cost of lockdown. They didn't even worry about it. So what it's done is it's massively stratified the social order, and it's never more obvious to me than, when you go on social media and people bragging about, I'm doing the right thing for society by staying home. It's like, oh, really? How healthy are you? I'm perfectly healthy. How old are you? I'm 28. There's the possibility that you're going to experience something severe outcomes from COVID are far less than what you normally experience with the flu or by driving or any other risks in life, and you think you're doing good for society. Well, who is going to, or what is going to bear the burden of this virus? And it's like, well, I don't know. Well, how about the people that are delivering the groceries to your doorstep? Right. What about the people that are in the meatpacking plants? The construction workers that are still working, the hospital workers, everybody out there who's still doing their thing to allow you to luxuriate at home. What they don't understand is that they're recreating a kind of a pre-modern caste system. It's always been the case in the past that societies have assigned to the lower classes and the working classes the burden of a disease. Herd immunity is a real thing. It's not a strategy. It's not a theory. It's just how evolution treats viruses. That once viruses infect mild ones, particularly like this one, once it has infected enough people and it can't find a host anymore, then it goes endemic, which is to say manageable and predictable, and we move on with life. And that's sort of the way it always works. But somebody has to get it. And in order for that to happen, you can't just run away. So what's happened is the ruling class has decided that it will hide in its castles and its apartments, and with their Zoom calls and Netflix, while forcing the workers and peasants to get the disease.
It's so right on.
Yeah, it's undemocratic. It's unequal. It's contrary to liberalism and modernity. In the past, in the slaveocracies of the South, we have empirical evidence the slaves experienced a far, far greater degree of disease. And that's because the people, the lords and the manors and the slaveholders in their estates were always running away from the bug when it came along annually.
I think about the Medicis in Florence building roads above the city for private roads for them to walk across while everyone else is suffering.
I mean, it's what's ironic, and then of course, India, develops an entire social system around this idea that there's some classes that are unclean, and that's why it's very frustrating to my liberal friends in India. They want to develop welfare systems, but it's part of, and it's been a long problem that there's a perception in India that you should not help the poor. You should not try to lift people out. That it's their job of the unclean to stay unclean and bear the burden of herd immunity for the rest of society. That's always been a tendency of pre-modern life. But with modernity, we kind of forged a new kind of social contract that exists within the framework of the prevalence and reality of infectious diseases, which to say we're not going to assign the burden of disease to people based on class, race, religion, language, and all these other kind of categories. Instead, we're going to use intelligence, figure out who's vulnerable to the disease, protect them, and then let it circulate and let the rest of society become exposed so that we can bolster our immune systems and live longer, healthier lives. That was a kind of deal we made, post-Enlightenment.
Right.
And America has always complied with this. I mean, George, it's very interesting because smallpox was a huge issue during the American Revolution. It didn't stop anything.
Right. It is shocking to think how we have such a bad education on history that we don't understand that these things have happened before, and we've dealt them in far better ways and far different ways. I don't know, some may be better, some may be worse, but what it didn't do is shut down an entire nation.
We had a very early experiment with shutdowns in 1918 with the Spanish flu, and they were very limited. Like New York never did anything, but there was shutdowns and some limited quarantines and shutdowns in Chicago and San Francisco. But what public health specialists learned from those is that they didn't solve the problem, and they created new problems aside from the virus, and it created a tremendous amount of political division. I mean, the anti-mask league of San Francisco was riotous and wild. I would have joined it. But the quarantines, so what happens? It's like psychologically, is that people always, for something invisible, like a bacteria or a virus, something you can't see, your mind, we're restless with the idea that we can't control it, we can't see it. So what we do is we assign it, we assign the guilt to other people, and we just assume that people who are not like us have it. And I'm telling you, this has been true all this whole year. It's pretty funny. I can tell you some stories from my own life. And it's like, people always assume the virus is somewhere else. It's not here, but it's over there. So we need to keep those people out. And how do we decide who has it? Well, is it somebody who looks just like me and dresses in a kind of nice way and smells pretty? No, she doesn't have a coronavirus. But what about that sort of sloppy guy over there? It looks a little bit foreign to me, and he doesn't quite speak English. He's probably a disease carrier. That's sort of what people do. Once you start stigmatizing disease, and once you start assigning disease to other people, it's always going to be the minorities and the marginalized who are attacked. And this happened in 1918, and public health specialists were mortified at the treatment of Chinese immigrants during the pandemic, all of whom were assumed to be carriers of the flu. Of course, right? What else are you going to do?
Right.
I know this is how it works. We just otherize the virus. It's very grim. By the way, you could find many occasions in the Bible which this is true too.
Yeah.
Where Jesus has all kinds of encounters with lepers, but it's not clear that they're actually lepers. I mean, like this one guy, Simon the leper, got a little bit sick 20 years ago or something, and they assigned him the title Simon the leper, and he's like, what the hell? And so he goes to Jesus and says, look, everybody calls me Simon the leper. I'm just Simon, It's like, can you declare, because he was a rabbi, can you declare me clean and fit to go into the temple, not sinful, in other words, sin and disease being always identified, an identity in history. And Jesus said, yeah, I get it, annoying, all right, you're now Simon, he's like, thanks a lot. So
don't go telling people that.
Right. So this is how we do. And so after 1918, there was a huge push in America among really interesting sort of, I would say it was progressive era public health specialists who despite their progressive politics, were nonetheless earnest about, like, let's not make this mistake again. And then in the 1920s and 1930s, we had huge innovations concerning immunity theory, viruses, herd immunity, the mutation of viruses, how they work, the relationship between our immune systems and then great progress on developing a kind of stable, scientific, easily distribute smallpox vaccine. So that was a great moment. And so after that, the American media really had been in sync with public health establishment in the United States against ever doing anything like what happened in 1918 again, against lockdowns, against travel restrictions, school closures out of the question. The idea of banning mass events. No, you want mass events. That's what you want.
Right.
And so there, everybody's united. So in 1948, the big push again, for the polio vaccine, the Polio Foundation, which turned into the March of Dimes and so on. It was really important for the public health establishment in this country to not politicize these viruses, but rather assign the job of disease mitigation to medical professionals. That was a really important priority. So as you know, FDR himself had suffered from polio, but the new Polio Foundation, which was established, I guess, I don't know, in the mid-1930s, something like that, he asked to be their spokesman, and they refused. They said, look, we need to understand that this is about disease. The minute you come in and endorse this, everybody's going to think this is, pro New Deal political trick. So they really kept him at arm's length. And during the epidemics of the late 40s and early 50s, where polio was quite wicked. I mean, like when it would strike you, it would strike typically young girls from the ages of 9 and 12 and maim them for life. It's like, talk about heartbreaking, Right. But there were outbreaks, as many spots around the country. But I'm only aware of one case in which something was closed, and it was a swimming pool in San Angelo, Texas, because there was a belief that it was maybe transmitted through water or something like that, which is not quite right. But we remained completely open. And then we had a real challenge in 1957-58 with the Asian flu, which was really deadly. I mean, we had a population that didn't live past 65 in those days, and we were had a third of the population numbers that we have today, and 110,000 people died from that very, very wicked flu. But there wasn't, New York Times had, going back and looking at it, they had one editorial about it, and the editorial was, stay calm. If you get sick, see your doctor. We'll handle this through professional means, and that's it. So just move on with life. They were really dedicated to not creating panic, because panic doesn't do anything. It disrupts society and makes it more difficult to deal with what is a medical problem. And then the same thing happened in 68 and 69 with the Hong Kong flu, which barely made the headlines, but still killed 100,000 people. And we still had Woodstock and so on. And thank God we did, because that's one of the reasons that the Hong Kong flu was not more deadly than it was. We quickly saw that the best way to deal with a virus is to make it endemic. And that means we need as much exposure to non-vulnerable people as possible. And it's extraordinary. We used to know this.
This makes so much sense, and it's so frustrating that we're going back to medieval times, it seems like. Oh,
well,
man.
That's February 27th, the New York Times, Donald McNeil, to handle this virus, let's go full medieval. Well, we did. And we abolished dentistry for 3 months. There was a 70% decline in the people who went to the dentist. We got rid of dentistry in this country. People were banned from hospitals. 350 hospitals in this country furloughed workers because they had no patients, because they had reserved by government mandate, reserved all their facilities for coronavirus patients who didn't arrive. And so they were had to sitting on their hands. So people missed vaccinations and cancer screenings and every kind of. Oh, the carnage has been awful. And just to show you how medieval we decided to go, Cuomo and de Blasio in New York decided to blame the Hasidic Jews for being super spreaders because of their weddings and funerals. I mean, that's how,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, that's where we're going now. But it's like, so the Jews are causing society to get disease. Very, very interesting. I mean, that's the term poison the well. Is actually an anti-Semitic canard dating from the Middle Ages, where people would always blame Jews for any kind of disease outbreaks. Oh, they're poisoning the well. That's what they used to say. And so, sure enough, you have de Blasio and Cuomo in New York blaming the Hasidim for the disease outbreaks in New York. And so, infection fatality rate is among Hasidic Jews in New York from coronavirus?
What is that? I don't know.
Essentially 0. And, you know, I confront people about this, and I said, well, it's because it's a younger population. Well,
yeah. And that's
right.
And that's the other thing. I mean, my understanding, and again, I'm just a crazy musician, but my understanding is that you can, the only thing that you can predict on how a policy did as far as, you know, the deaths and let's talk specifically about deaths, is how it took care of elderly people in nursing homes. And if you did a good job with that, you probably did okay as far as the death rate. If you didn't do a good job of that, you probably had a major spike.
That's true. And empirically, you can chart the deaths per capita or deaths per million in each state relative to the percentage of the population that lives in long-term care facilities, and see it's like a visibly statistical correlation between the two. In other words, somewhere like South Dakota, which, you know, stay completely open, has, you know, pretty high deaths per million, not super high, but, you know, relatively high compared to Vermont, which closed. So I've seen people on Twitter saying, look, South Dakota stayed open, they have high deaths per million, Vermont stayed closed, and they don't have any. Well, there are other explanations. I mean, the number one is that Vermont has is listed on 49th in the country in terms of the number of long-term care facilities they have. It's a relatively young population, and nobody's in nursing homes, whereas South Dakota has a higher percentage of elderly people in nursing homes. So sometimes, like, it'd be nice to have perfect capacity to manage these things so that nobody ever dies. But unfortunately, you know,
that's not how it works.
Yeah, that's nursing homes are yeah.
I mean,
yeah. So, well, you know, I mean, so it's not about whether you're open or closed. It's really, but I tell you something else is very interesting. You mentioned one of the things you'd think that we would know how to do is, in the case of nursing homes, like, don't bring the coronavirus into them. You'd think that would just be like a no-brainer. Well, Cuomo did, and the guy in New Jersey did. And just this morning, the Boston Herald has an article that says they're putting coronavirus patients in nursing homes to prevent hospital overcrowding.
You're kidding me.
True story. It came out just this morning. It's like, here we are, month 11 into this, and they're doing the same damn thing again.
Like, that's criminal. That seems criminal to me to do that, because it's for as many times as one might get yelled at for not wearing a mask in a store. And it's these same people that are putting people into nursing homes where people are actually dying. Sorry, that's a shocking. I'm speechless with what you.
Well, you know, it's a kind of an illustration of just the absurdity of these policies. That here's another example. I mean, these governors and mayors just doing random things, like in New York City, a city that's been completely wrecked by this stuff, by the way. But they somehow decided that the virus wasn't going to come out after 10 p.m. I'm just whatever kind of random control you can impose. Well, what that did was, you know, a lot of elderly New Yorkers, and what the sort of informal system in New York City is that elderly people, which is to say relatively more vulnerable populations, would go to dinner early and have peace and quiet, and, you know, some distance between each other, and eat casually, and then leave, and then That would last till about 8 o'clock or something, and then the younger people come in, and then by 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock is an entirely useful crowd, and they're partying until 2, 3 a.m. Well, okay, you shut everything down at 10. Now suddenly you've got everybody crammed in together, thereby making, from 6 to 10, thereby making the older populations actually exposed to people, that they shouldn't be exposed to. I mean, it's like exactly the opposite results have come about from a policy that was meant to contain the virus. It's actually potentially going to spread it further, among the people who we need to protect.
And okay, and this takes me to something I wanted to discuss with you, and that is something that I think I can fairly say that you helped to facilitate, and that's the Great Barrington Declaration. And I think this is a really important document. It's a really important statement that was made. And can you take us through maybe a little bit of what that is and what that's about?
Well, it's a plain statement of cell biology and public health, nothing more than that. And people act like it's some sort of dramatic revelation. It was what everybody knew this time last year, basically. that viruses can't be fully suppressed. That
Before we got amnesia.
Yeah. Viruses cannot be viruses. We live among viruses. This is the millionth virus we've had in the course of our evolution, and there's going to be another million after. So, society must live amidst infectious disease. It's a matter of how you want to deal with it, and the best way to deal with it is by maintaining normal social functioning, and protect the vulnerable populations. And it's a matter of figuring out who they are. We know who they are, and there's ways to deal with it. And otherwise, anything else you do is going to create ghastly costs with increased poverty and hunger and life disruption, despair, suicide, drug overdoses, and so on. And so this is what it pointed out, and then it recommends at the end that we need to let all non-vulnerable populations continue to just go back to regular life, and hold events and go to the movies and go to sports and all the rest of it, and keep a profound fixation on making it possible for those people among the vulnerable populations who are worried about the virus to stay away while herd immunity is obtained and the virus becomes endemic. I mean, that was what the statement said. What was remarkable about the statement is that it was, I guess you could say, the timing and the people who made it. And
yes.
I was on an interview yesterday with the guy who was going on about crediting me for this, and I said, well, I'll accept all your compliments on behalf of the people who actually did this. But then that was three very courageous academics who decided to stick their necks out and just tell what's true. Right. They didn't have to do that, and they've faced, terrible attacks on their lives and reputations, as a result of having. And that's Martin Kulldorff of Harvard, Jay Bhattacharya of Stanford, and then Sunetra Gupta of Oxford. All three were
these
here.
Aren't flubs in the world of. These are not your normal. I mean, that to me, the credentials of these people, and I looked a little bit into it, are incredible, and it should be heard and spoken loudly to the world what these people are saying.
Sunetra is the world's leading epidemiologist, and I don't think many people would disagree with that. She is really a philosopher of infectious diseases, and really it was the grace of my life to spend the weekend with her. I mean, she is just something else. Just sitting around the living room and with casual conversation, she drops these truth bombs that just blow my mind. I mean, she is just something remarkable. What a vision she has. Kulldorff is an infectious disease statistician who's been, probably the leading statistician behind assessing the effectiveness of various vaccines and how they work and what populations need them, and is really heavily involved in the industry and really knows the stuff, and has, 200 papers credited to his name. And then Jay Bhattacharya is both an MD and a PhD, in this case an MD plus a PhD in economics, and is a public health specialist. So
wow.
These people are mighty, but they just got fed up in September or something like that. I dropped Martin a note because I saw him tweeting against lockdowns in a way which I had been. And I dropped a note and I said, why don't you come visit us for the weekend? We could all just hang out. And so I invited a couple of attorneys from New York who had similarly become anti-lockdown. And the a movement kind of began to develop from that first meeting. And we didn't have any agenda. We just hung out for the weekend. And then it was about 2 weeks later, he called me up and said, we don't have any time to wait. We need to get together. And Martin was very interesting. He said, there's a real problem in the journalistic community that they don't understand anything about viruses and how they work. So what we need to do is bring in, say, 3 or 4 or 5 really high-end people who are in a position to make a difference and teach them about viruses and public health. And I said, well, when are we going to do this? And I said, well, but there's time in 3 weeks. And he said, well, really, it needs to happen this weekend.
Oh, wow.
So we scrambled and miraculously got Sinatra over here, and then
isn't she in England?
Yeah. So that was a real trick to get her here, and then we got Jay over here, and we held all the sessions, and everything's online. I get these emails every day from weird conspiracy theorists that say, I need to schedule a time to come and see all your archives about the Great Barrington Declaration and figure out what's really, as if I've got a box somewhere, that's got all our secrets. So we're secretly funded by the UK Ministry of Defense, as one article recently claimed. It was hilarious. And I just tell the guy, look, I don't know, what else can we do? We filmed everything. We put all the films online of everything. And we've got a frequently asked questions on the website. You can go and read it. I mean, they're ridiculously transparent in terms of all their relationships and everything. So it's like, there's nothing else to learn. If I knew it, I would post it. We don't have any secrets. Oh. But anyway, the important thing about that document is that it really did cause a big shift in the way people were thinking about this. The Great Barrington Declaration gave people who are instinctively against lockdowns a language apparatus to understand why they are and what a better alternative would be. So that was a real change. And it gave people courage that, okay, if these people are willing to risk their names and their careers to say something like this, maybe I should too. So that was really the birth of the movement. I think that was early October, and things have really accelerated since then. That website has received this. Now, keep in mind, this is not like a big, complicated website. It's got a front page, 50 translations of the same thing, a page of signatures with a map of where the signers are, and a page of frequently asked questions. So it's not, we're not talking the Wall Street Journal. This is just this page with 3 pages, and it has, since its release, been viewed 20 million times.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I think that's a statement of the starkness, the difference that people are hearing and what they know, that there's something not right between what they're hearing and here's this light in the darkness saying, no, there's another way that we should think about this whole problem.
What's interesting about this is that as the document was being signed, Jay of Editorial said to me, this is going to be signed by 1 million people. And I thought, look, I've been in web development all my life, and I know the way the information age works. I think we're going to be lucky if anybody even pays any attention to this thing. So he was right, I was wrong. But what's funny about this is that, the stress has been so extreme with, when you wake up in the morning and you've got 150 emails, from New York Times reporters, The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, PBS calling, local news. You've got, the mayor.
And it remains.
Yeah. And, the town council of Great Barrington, signed a big denunciation. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah. It's just, the whole thing's just, so anyway, I felt this kind of need to take care of Jay, Sinatra, and Martin. So I'd call them up every once. I'd say, hey, how are you holding up? And that sort of thing. But every time I would do this, they would flip it on me and go, listen, how are you holding up? Are you okay? Are you getting through this? Listen, thank you so much for all you've done for us. And I'm like, me done for you. Look what you've done for us. I mean, it's unbelievable. But one of the things that I think that they knew from the beginning, which I did not know, is that there was no question that the world would at some point come around to seeing that they were right. Mm-hmm. They knew this. And the reason they knew it was because they were just stating what everybody knew this time last year, what everybody knew, which is the basics of cell biology and public health principles, that you need to consider the whole, not just one thing. You need to consider the long term, not just the short term. They made a very plain statement. They all three knew for sure that 2020 was a year in which everybody kind of went mad, but that things would get back to normal and people would see what was true, and that most everybody, there's always some holdouts, would see that the Great Barrington Declaration was right all along. They've always known this.
Yeah, that's well, and that kind of confidence, I think people felt that confidence, and they see that, okay, this I'm trying to think. There's a statement. Dennis Prager once said that studies either solidify what I innately know is true, or they're wrong. And I don't know if that's exactly right, but I think there is something deep inside us that we know, like, what is going on right now is not right. And to have those kind of credentialed people, being able to meet and share their knowledge so that it can give us courage. In other words, when people are, you're talking about the New York Times and these people that you're getting emails from all the time. Well, I think on a smaller basis, that's what everybody's feeling. Again, when you walk in the store or when you're talking to your friends on Facebook and it's a constant, masks and lockdowns and are you going to kill grandma? I mean, these things are just have been throughout this entire ordeal for people.
Well, the lies have been overwhelming. For me, that's just what's been so frustrating about it, because, you see something that contradicts, the Barrington Declaration out there, and it's like, oh, the CDC says that restaurants are going to kill you. And you're like, I think I need to look more carefully at the study. It turns out the entire study is bogus on the face of it, and it's easy to refute. And this has been going on for a long time, or when the New York Times reported the sheer inaccuracy of PCR testing, which was developed for research, not diagnostic purposes. When you see Fauci getting on television saying herd immunity means that 70% have to be infected in order to obtain it, whereas in fact, you look at the research, it could be as low as 10% because of shared immunities with SARS-CoV-1 and other coronaviruses and T cell memory. It's when you see, and Fauci has played a particularly pernicious role here, because he doesn't care about the research. He doesn't look at the studies. He wakes up every day to plan his media appearances, and that's all he's been doing all year. And meanwhile, the research is pouring out. We now have 22 studies, global studies, showing there's no relationship at all between disease outcomes and lockdowns, right? So it doesn't matter. I mean, just like stay open, close, where the virus is going to do what it's going to do. And we have 22 studies. I feel sorry for all these people who had to do all this stuff. And then they drop these studies in peer-reviewed journals, and then Fauci, that pays no attention to them whatsoever, and still gets on television saying, we know these mitigation strategies work. No, we don't. That's not true. That's just not true. I mean, even the masks are very much in dispute. I mean, it was like, I think it was only in March, the Journal of the American Medical Association had an article on masks and said they do nothing to stop the virus. Maybe they provide some comfort to healthcare workers if you're wearing them in hospitals and stuff like that. But for the most part, these masks are just what they call talisman. They're just symbols. They don't actually achieve anything. And at American Institute for Economic Research, we ran an article by a chemist who used to work in the PPE industry, and it's like, the mask has holes the size of your apartment complex, and the virus is about the size of the button on your shirt. I mean, this is what we're dealing with here. And the social distancing thing, was a complete and utter nonsense made up by a 14-year-old girl in 2006, and her physicist father turned her fears of cooties into an academic paper. Wow. That in a totalitarian way imagined that he would be in charge of society.
Isn't that rich?
Apart. Yeah.
We're taking orders from, wow. I know our time is short, and there's another aspect of this that I'd really like you to speak to if you can. And it is I think a long term, maybe short term, I don't know, but that's the effect of inflation. I mean, we have seen an additional $4 trillion being printed out of nothing. We're seeing riots, which interestingly aren't against the government, but are against capitalism in many regards. I mean, we're seeing, and I imagine, I see this printing of money, this inflation that's happening, and I just imagine like the black hole of wealth of the world being sucked into the Fed. And I wonder what is your take, and do you see it the same way I do, or just some other way I should be looking at this?
Well, I'll tell you. First of all, these policies of inflating and spending money to fix the economy are ridiculous. You can't stimulate something that you've made illegal. I mean, the lockdowns shut down all essential social and economic functioning. You can't replace that with a bunch of money, just throwing money all over society. You know, I don't know what that means. I mean, it's like, I don't know. I don't know. It's like if you got a guy strapped down, you know, to the ground, and then you keep stuffing his mouth full of steroids and telling him to run. I mean, you've got a problem, and that's essentially what all this has done. I mean, the best way to get out of this economic disaster we're facing, where there's been 45% increase in the number of people reported being, you know, very, very hungry. I mean, the food lines, even in the richest counties in this country, are around the block. I mean, we have done horrible things to ourselves, and yeah, these policies were increase the debt, and if you want to really scare yourself, you can go to the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis data service called FRED and look up M1 and M2 and see, you know, astonishing increases, and, you know, flow the data by percentage of increase relative to the past, and you will see things that make it look like we're about to become the new Weimar, you know?
Right.
The only thing about that, and I'm not a monetary economist, but I do work with him. I talked to Thomas Hogan here, who's a real specialist in this area, and he said, you know, those charts are telling what's true, but those reserves are being poured into the banks, and the banks are, for the most part, keeping them on deposit with the Federal Reserve because the Federal Reserve pays them still more to hold them rather than to lend them. So there is a disincentive to, you know, turn these increases into hot money on the street, you know.
Right.
So there's probably not a grave danger of cataclysmic results from what appears to be unprecedented, and it is kind of unprecedented, but he thinks that because of the structure of the banking system and this relationship with the Fed, that they're kind of doing right now, they're repeating what they did in 2008. Which was similarly saw a huge increase in the money supply. It distorts the markets, but it may not result in sort of the death of the dollar scenarios. A lot depends on what the Fed does in 2021.
Okay, that's fair enough, and I appreciate that perspective. Again, this is And If Love Remains. We're talking to Jeffrey Tucker, who is the editorial director for the American Institute for Economic Research. His latest book is Liberty or Lockdown. I have really thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, Jeffrey. It's been a pleasure. Let me ask you this: other than reading your book, and I encourage everyone to go and get your book and read it, and looking at the Great Barrington Declaration, what would you recommend people? What can they do that you know, what would you recommend that they do as far as living their daily lives? You know, what would you say people ought to do in this time?
I would say your first obligation is not to be a selfish, immoral bastard, and by which I mean, don't think you're doing the world a favor by being in your snuggly clothes on the sofa watching binging Netflix. That is not doing any good for anybody. You need to get out there and be a little more courageous, and don't be afraid of this virus. You know, and for if you're young and you're healthy, and by that I mean really I mean healthy. You know, because the difference between severe outcomes and nothing on this virus really comes down to the strength of your immune system. So, and stop making bogus excuses for yourself. I mean, I've heard this nonsense. Well, I've got my grandmother, I've been immunocompromised because I was bit by a tick 20 years ago. You name it. People make the biggest excuses for behaving like a lazy member of the ruling class and forcing the workers and peasants to bear the burden of disease. I think that's wrong. So get out there. Don't be afraid. Don't let anybody intimidate you. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I think this is a time for speaking out. And so one of the things I get every day is a Google alert for the Great Barrington Declaration. And one of the things that's kind of strangely impressed me, we used to talk about letters to the editor back in the old days. Everybody would talk about writing a letter to the editor of the local newspaper. And somehow we think in the age of mass media communication and stuff, that doesn't really matter. Actually, people have been taking to writing letters to a local newspaper with signed by their names so that their community will read it and citing the Great Barrington Declaration and condemning lockdowns. And I've seen more and more and more of these, and I believe that does some good. I mean, we are turning the corner on public opinion on this. People are fed up, and they need people to stand up and point to a better way. The other thing is that, if I can just kind of do a little bit of a push to American Institute for Economic Research, we were founded in the midst of a crisis in 1933, and we've always stuck our neck out when it really mattered, and we did it this year. Our first article on the coronavirus was January 27th, and we've been saying the same thing from then to now, which is the way to manage the disease is to manage the disease, not put the politicians and bureaucrats in charge of it and disable society. So, and we've probably run 700 articles on the topic by now. Subscribe to our daily email, and you'll get our best research on the topic. The other thing you might consider is, maybe, it helps our employees here to know that we have public support. And that comes through not just from clicks, but people willing to throw us, $50 at the year end of the year. I mean, this means a lot to us, that we're on track, because we've faced the slings and arrows, I tell you, this year for this position we've taken. We haven't been entirely alone, but a lot of times it felt that way. So it's I think AIR would welcome public support.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. So if you can find that at aier.org. Go check out the American Institute for Economic Research. Yes, and yeah, throw them some donations if you're able to. I think it's this kind of work those dollars go to a huge way of getting the word out and getting these ideas out in the open more. So I appreciate you saying that. And yeah, let's definitely live our lives a little more freely, a little more openly. Let's have a little more courage. Good words there. Jeffrey A. Tucker, I sincerely appreciate your time with us here at And If Love Remains. Thank you for being on the show.
Mike, you're a wonderful interviewer, and I've really enjoyed my time. It went by like just minutes, so I'm really grateful to you. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure, my pleasure. This is And If Love Remains.